Hello. So I'm just going to give a little brief background. Tonight we're presenting an evening of films by Mark Morrisroe, known for his depictions of lovers, friends, hustlers, and roommates. Morrisroe's imagery combines the diaristic with the melodramatic. His documentation of the post-punk scenes of Boston and New York in the 1970s and 80s were seen through a lens of romantic degradation and decay. Most well known for his photographic collages, Morrisroe also produced 3 films between 1981 to 1984. Each were shot on Super 8 film, and that's what we'll be seeing this evening. These home movies starred Morrisroe and his films, or and his friends, and were filled with thrift store costumes, cheap gore, trashy dialogue, and gratuitous nudity. The first film, The Laziest Girl in Town, from 1981, is about 23 minutes. It's a delirious drag comedy of 3 women who sit around preparing to go out while singing, fighting, and sexually pleasing themselves with vegetables. It stars Morrisroe, Stephen Tejan, and Jack Pearson. The second film, Hello from Bertha, from 1983, is 17 minutes, and it's based upon a one-act play by Tennessee Williams, in which he plays Bertha, in which Morrisroe plays Bertha, a lovesick prostitute dying in a flea bag bordello. And lastly, Nymphomaniac from 1984, 36 minutes. It's a mixture of trash and splatter film, and it's the darkest film of the 3. It tells the story of a phone sex operator and her girlfriends, one of whom comes to a violent end. The program will run about 76 minutes, and after the screening will follow with a conversation between curator Stuart Cameron and Morrisroe's partner, Ramsey McPhillips. I wanted to say thank you to the estate of Mark Morrisroe at Photo Museum, I'm not going to get this right, Vertiker, who lent us the films for this screening, as well as 356 Mission, who generously provided us the space. And lastly, of course, to Ramsey and to Stuart for not only giving their time on this holiday weekend, but continuing their effort to share Morrisroe's work. Thank you.
This is Ramsey McPhillips. I'm Stuart Cameron. In a way, I think we wanted Ramsey here tonight, partly because he's sort of the other bookend. These films were made really before Mark had a career in the art world. He was still living in Boston, where the apartment was, where these films were shot. Ramsey entered the picture much later, when Mark was in New York City, already fairly well known, showing with Pat Hearn Gallery. And Ramsey was with him when he died, in fact, from AIDS. So there were very different experiences, I think, of Mark at that time. But I think also it's really important to see these films if you know the photographs. I think people who are familiar with the Boston School, like certainly Nan Goldin, Jack Pearson, who appears in 2 of the films, or Mark's work, always talks about a sort of romantic quality. And I think that leaves out the more dark, violent side of things that obviously comes into play, particularly in Nymphomaniac, in the final film tonight. John Waters was incredibly influential on Mark, and Lynette White, who plays, what's the character's name with the sort of Consuela in Nymphomaniac, was very close with Mark and very involved with him at the time these films were made. But she sort of supported his obsession with John and was actually trying to help him stalk him when John would screen his films in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But John Waters said something along the lines of, if somebody vomits watching my films, it's like getting a standing ovation. And I think, a lot of people talk about Jack Smith or about the Kuchars or about a number of other precedents and experimental films for these films, or for that matter, Ryan Trecarton or a number of younger artists who are making work to some extent in this mode. But I think in many ways it's really John Waters and Tennessee Williams who are the primary references in these films, or the major influences on Mark at that time. But I mean, when you met Mark, I mean, these films were already several years old at that point, but he pretty much given up filmmaking, although no, he hadn't, because he wanted to make that final Tennessee Williams film.
Yeah, in fact, the first night that I met Mark, he offered me a film role in his coming, fourth film, which was The Bar in a Tokyo Hotel, another Tennessee Williams a play that was very obscure, that he was going to reverse the genders and play the lead role, which was an artist named Mark, who had gone to Tokyo to look for inspiration, and his very unattractive American wife, who was an alcoholic and a floozy, went along with him. And it takes basically place back and forth between two scenes. Mark locked in his Tokyo hotel room, having a psychotic event and believing that his career was over, and suddenly having inspiration that he had reinvented color, and threw himself on the floor and splattered paint all over himself and rolled around in it, while his wife was downstairs trying to make out with the very handsome Japanese bartender. The last act is her realizing that her husband is really not worth anything to her unless he's dead. Convinces his dealer, Leonard, I think his name was, to come to Tokyo all of a sudden and quasi push Mark over the edge so that his psychosis would lead to suicide. And then the wife and the dealer would be sitting pretty. Obviously, dead artists oftentimes are more valuable than a living artist. And that's the end of the play. Sadly, Mark never lived to put that on, but it's a very short, very poignant cap to his life. It's so prophetic. He wanted me to play Leonard. I don't know how that fit in. Certainly didn't try to make Mark die, but I was with him with the final psychosis, that's for sure. So that was the fourth film that's yet undone, and it should be made, by someone.
But I remember, one of the first shows I saw of Mark's would have been sometime in the late 1980s at Pat Hearn's gallery. And there was a table like this in the back of the gallery in Soho, and loads of Polaroids in plastic sleeves just kind of scattered across the table. And the audience was invited to come in and just sort of mix them around. And it was almost like making a film. There was something very cinematic about them. But I didn't even know that he'd made those films at that time. I think most people didn't know that he made these films. But to some extent, he and Pat went back to the Boston days, and Pat had been running one of the very first ever cable public access television shows run by an artist effectively, and it was known for presenting fairly controversial, subversive material.
It was as the technology was coming out. It was at MIT, and because they were in school in Boston, they could jump between different institutions. So they took class at Tufts, MIT, a couple classes at Harvard, and there was a very fluidity between a lot of them. And Pat especially was very intrigued with video, and that art form, it was blossoming out of the technological sort of nerd culture of MIT. And so she was given one of the first cable access TV shows out of MIT, and she was very provocative, but sort of Jackie Onassis, with a mother who was, a salesperson at Dunkin' Donuts. I don't even know how to describe that woman. She was incredible. One of my favorite characters in all humanity in the art world. But she had this very regal presence, but a very lower middle class background. And she would sit in front of these video cameras and basically sort of in an Andy Warhol kind of way make things happen around her with doing very little. And the shows got more and more intense, and more people were watching. And Stuart can describe to you perhaps the final show that ended the Pat Hearn show was a Mark Morrisroe event.
And before we get on to that, I just wanted to maybe mention it, to sort of outline the sort of violent streak that obviously shows up in these films and where it began. But also, these films might seem completely random, amateur, scattershot. They were totally strategic. They were planned within an inch of their lives. They were scripted. I think the scene when you see Jack Pearson rehearsing the line over and over again, are you a transsexual, are you a transvestite, et cetera, and take after take after take. Mark wanted to be very, very famous, and he really did plot these films. These were not just offhand amateur events at all. But, you'll probably remember the details more about the MIT video than I do.
Well, so Mark had a cat, which you saw in one of those films named Lefty, Lefty had one white paw on his left front paw. And Lefty became quite sick. And Mark didn't have any money. He claimed that he had spent his last $15 on penicillin for some of his activities in life, and took the cat to the Humane Society, and the Humane Society refused it because he didn't have the $15 to have the cat put down. So he took the cat home and, in a very brutal way, tried to poison the cat with paint and filmed it. And that didn't work. And so then he drew on the cat. The cat was smothered in paint, and then he drowned it in the toilet. And he filmed this. Pat Hearn invited Mark to show a film on her show. At this point, she'd already had shows where they already had done body paint themselves in such incredible technique that you could barely even tell they were naked. So she pushed some envelopes, and that had gone over the air of all of MIT and Cambridge. So, having not seen the film, she invited Mark to show it. And instantly, there was an incredible uproar, which there should have been. Pat was called into MIT and the Boston School and expelled. Her show was terminated, but they wanted to get to the author of the film. And Pat refused to give the name of Mark. And Mark was a sniveling person when it came to those kind of things. He, whenever there was a huge controversy and he was about to lose credit or fame or trajectory forward, he would back into the shadows. He wasn't willing to take, he was an incredible provocateur, incredible. Swastikas, there was nothing below his, but when the shit hit the fan, Mark couldn't really take credit for it, but Pat did. And somehow, because they were in their 5th year at their universities, and Pat's show had been such a sensation, and the president of MIT called the ASPCA and begged them not to sue the university and reinstated them all, and they all graduated. But Mark barely, he'd already received his awards at that point, so they didn't revoke them. But that film was then shuffled out of town with the filmmaker. Mark was the actor who was killing the cat. And he did not graduate from Boston School. He left Cambridge because of it and fled to Los Angeles. And he gave up art. He was far more interested in music. His name is Steve Stain. And he still has the film, but it's never been shown again.
And then there was also a rumor that Mark liked to propagate that he was the product of an affair between his mother and the Boston Strangler.
So I began to do a biography of Mark and went and backtracked Mark's life as best I could after he died, living in Cambridge and Boston in the same apartments, and was able to validate that rumor to a point. This is what is the truth. Mark's mother rented their home from Albert DeSalvo, which was next door to each other. Albert DeSalvo had numerous affairs outside of his marriage. I found the rent checks and all that sort of stuff. The time frame of Mark's birth with Albert DeSalvo's trajectory of crimes and his incarceration would lead you to believe that that was possible. There was I could never find he was, not there. And I got so adamant about finding this fact out that I contacted F. Lee Bailey, who's an international, famous lawyer who represented Albert DeSalvo's wife and children, and have several letters back and forth between him, and he didn't discount that might be possible based on what I was providing to him. And I was, at one point, had collected in sort of an art form a lot of Mark's blood in a very horrible incident in a hospital. And so I had Mark's DNA tested. And I sent this DNA over to F. Lee Bailey, and F. Lee Bailey died. And I never heard from him. but I still have the DNA. There are 2 children of Albert DeSalvo out there somewhere. And if you look at the picture of Mark next to the picture of Albert DeSalvo, maybe.
And he was also shot.
Mark, tomorrow will be the 39th anniversary of Mark's shooting. He was shot on Christmas Eve while performing a trick at age 16 on Beacon Hill. And Mark and Linnell, the one who played Consuelo, at that time were living together and turning tricks to buy art supplies. They were more than supporting themselves in very inexpensive apartments. They truly were driven at that point to make art, and that's how they paid for it. But this one trick went very wrong. The man refused to pay. This is Mark's one of 50 stories that Mark told. Mark went for his wallet. The guy had a gun, shot Mark, and there's a beautiful police report incident describing the placement of Mark's body, the scene as the officers entered the apartment, etc., which I received when I was backtracking Mark's life. It was a very bad Xerox when I went to get it the first time. I returned to Boston several years later, and the police department said that those files burned and that they no longer were there. And Mr. Bailey said that he had gotten a call from the police department and said that someone was backtracking Albert DeSalvo's life, and those crimes were never fully solved. So I wasn't able to get a better copy of the police report. But, it's a cold crime.
And so, to what extent do you think that those incidents might have formed the kind of dark psyche that would have produced films like this? And, did you talk much about this body of work when you were with him, or was he more focused on the photographs at that time?
Yeah, Mark, by the time I met Mark, he was really, really, really driven to be famous. I would get up at 9, Mark would have gotten up at 5 in the morning, made breakfast, done some photographs in a bathtub, cleaned the whole house, and would be screaming at me, you fucking lazy crock of shit, what are you doing? He was the most driven person I think I've ever known. And it was fame. He really wanted to be famous. And at that point, by the time I met him, there was a whiff of fame. Nan had already done the Ballad of Sexual Dependency. She was a year ahead of him or so at the museum school. Pat had already moved to New York City and had a gallery, etc. Jack and he were on the skids. I was Jack's replacement, so to speak. So Mark always was the top of the pinnacle, but he was still flailing and crazy and hyper creative and hadn't really worked out the business end of it. And everyone believed that Mark was going to be, if you spoke to Jack or to Nan or to David Armstrong or to all those people, Mark was going to be the most famous, and everyone was pacing his career and pushing him to be psychotic, because the more psychotic and the more provocative and the more bizarre that Mark was, the more beautiful his art was, that he then reined in with these techniques to make them look so serene and beautiful in a way, in their actual pointillism and technique. And then he died. So that's the incredible. And then Pat died, and then Colin DeLand died. And so those were the people who were in charge of Mark's career. So a lot of it got buried. And then people like Stuart have come up and written quite a bit about him, and he's been more contextualized.
But I'm also curious, with the photographs, they're so processed. And he was extremely innovative in terms of how he would process his photographs. The films are much more direct. And although they share an aesthetic, and I was actually sitting there just snapping some shots. And when you look at the shots of the film, as stills, they do approximate the photographs. So, it almost is, like I mentioned, the table at Pat's gallery. But there is still a fundamental difference between the two. And I think, the films allow this, extreme violence to have an effect that the photographs can never have. Nor do they really, I don't recall ever seeing any of the photographs that dealt with this kind of subject matter, particularly with, abortions or...
No, there's a lot of stills that are predominant throughout his work that are in collections, but they're the stills of Pretty Pia, in the bathtub, or the masks, or something that's very visually
But I
stimulating,
think
but there's no violence in them.
the gender fluidity that group is known for, or the sort of extreme experimentation, feels safer in the photographs. It's not safe in the films. It's totally, goes horribly wrong in the films. And I think there's a strong degree of misogyny that should be questioned, which in the photographs I think is less evident.
Yeah. Well, that was Mark's life was so horrific. His mother was a drug addict. Maybe his father was a serial killer. He he left home, he got shot, he was paralyzed in a leg. And so he manifested beauty to hide all of this incredible horror in his life. And in fact, that's what I was. I'm not of the same cloth artistically than those guttural, incredibly go-for-broke, brilliant artists. I was the nice wasp who was safe and sweet. And he literally just picked me out of, it was prophetic, so that I could be with him during those final years. And what I got out of it is this. I never would have had this very interesting relationship with the art world or with seeing someone that brilliant. To this day, I've never known anyone who was that smart. Really one of the most brilliant geniuses I've ever met. He never shut up. For every 10 sentences he said, there was something in there just incredibly golden. And it's really sad that he's gone.
And could you talk about the apartment and the building, in fact, in which he died? Because it's also an extraordinary story.
So Mark lived in Jersey City. He lived in Philip Taft's old apartment, which was handed down to him from Pat Hearn and Philip. And by the time when I met Mark, he wasn't HIV positive. And I realized that he probably should go get tested, and there were some telltale signs. And so very quickly, he did go get tested and was positive, and then developed some symptoms. So our relationship immediately became one of caretaker and finale, the Mark Morrisroe sort of end. And he had this apartment, and during the course of those 18 months, Mark's health deteriorated so badly that he was bedridden, and he was on a 5-story walk-up in Jersey City, and the neighborhood was very downtrodden, and the landlord was in the process of evicting everyone so that he could turn it into condos. But because of Mark's HIV status, he couldn't evict Mark. So Mark was on the top 5th floor. The whole rest of the building was gutted so that you could see through all the way to Manhattan through the walls. And you had to walk up this skeleton of a staircase with the wind and the snow blowing to what was like a trailer in the sky with Mark Morrisroe holding court like in bed, like in Hello from Bertha, trying to keep it together, looking pretty, making demands, trying to create art. Well, not trying, making incredible art. And it was an amazing. And then finally we got him to the hospital.
And his final words, if I'm not mistaken, were, "Could someone please turn off Oprah? She shouldn't have to watch this."
Right.
Which I think also suggests the degree to which he was so aware of the camera, of the lens, of the screen, and lived for it. He really was.
Yeah, the very end, we were in a hospital. The doctors and the nurses I had caught them doing some really heinous things, and so I extorted the best position in front of the nurse's window station, rather than call the police. And so they granted me that wish. So there was this big window with people behind it, staring at him 24/7. He wouldn't die. He was a cadaver. Every orifice was just oozing out blood and pus, but he still could talk. He was a skeleton who was talking, and all this nonsense, and he was somewhat on morphine. And so at the very end, he asked me to sign his 3-movie contract. So I went to the foot of his bed and took his chart, which is literally hanging at the end of a bed like some, General Hospital movie, and went up to put it in front of him, and his camera was on the side of the bed. And I said, well, I'll take a picture of you signing your contract. And I started to get the camera up, and he, sort of said, "Turn Oprah off. I don't want her to see this." And there was no TV on. And I raised the camera and clicked it, and he was dead. And the nurses came in and threw a blanket over him, and that was it. It was an incredible finale that he completely orchestrated. Mark's, if you look at Mark's Polaroids, there are a lot of him, but he claims them. Who took those pictures? They're not selfies. There's quite a bit of difference. So although I have an art degree and my medium was 665 film, and it still is, that predates Mark, I have a body of work. The time that I picked up that camera and took a picture of Mark is no different than Jack or Linnell or any of those people taking pictures of Mark, which is his huge body of work. It was just the last one.
But I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of the selfie too, because that whole group, Nan predates Wolfgang Tillmans for sure, but I remember when it was still somehow shocking or important that these resembled snapshots rather than fine art photography, and that was a revolution of its own in a way.
Yeah, but I have an art degree from a New England college, and I took photos, and that was my medium, but it wasn't included in my degree. I graduated in 1980, and I wasn't allowed to include my photo classes as part of my major.
But that's why the
wasn't
films,
considered a fine art.
The films too. They're so aggressively amateurish to a degree that. It's fascinating, and you think about Warhol or Jack Smith or people he would have certainly known, but the degree to which that was a revolution against the professionalism that he also wanted to have, and so, there's something about this idea of when he was turning the lens on himself, when he was turning it on this intimate group of friends, but then, using a Tennessee Williams script, using the bed as this kind of stage, that was not about the everyday. It was actually about, it was not what Nan was doing at all. It was completely different, and it was scripted.
Well, even the photograph of Mark, which is infamous, taken by Nan Goldin, of him holding a Jack Daniels bottle with his head slumped, with his shirt off, was completely staged. That wasn't Nan at a party catching Mark in a moment. That was like, Nan, I'll take my shirt off, and I'll hold the bottle like this, and you can take a picture. But that's woven into all of Nan's Ballad of Sexual Dependency as though it's a moment. It was a Mark Morrisroe moment. But that was the difference. You're right. Mark was totally staged, and Nan far more catching moments.
And Nan also, if you talk to her, is an incredible cinephile. She's seen every film ever made. It seems like she's read every book ever written. And I think, that group, was intensely well informed. As you said, they were brilliant.
And this museum school really has a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
Their incredible support. Mark's first assignment at college was to do something that no one would ever forget. So you can imagine what a bunch of freshman art students brought in. Mark went out into the quad, took all his clothes off, took some dog shit, smeared it all over himself, burst into the room and sang "The Moment I Walked in the Room, You Were Real Big," whatever. And, people wanted to expel him, but his professor said, no, the assignment was, no one will ever forget it. That was brilliant. The next thing he did was Linnell and Mark were supposed to do something about symbols. Mark brought in a swastika. Linnell brought in drink Coke. And she photocopied that over and over and over again and kept doing that for all of her assignments. Linnell was expelled for the drink Coke. Mark, because of his professors, because it was a symbol, was pushed on to upper levels of the academia. And that's the professors at that time in the 70s, late 70s.
But did he talk about his desire, again, just to piss people off, to shock or offend people? Was that an explicit desire that he spoke about, or was it just...
It was just a personality trait. By the time I met him, none of his friends would hang out with him. And so, I'm the nice, docile, sweet guy who had some manners. And I always, Mark, we'd go out to these art parties, and there would be the art party with, just everyone you can possibly imagine. exciting back in the early 80s in the New York art scene. And he'd make me wear 2 pair of jeans to make my butt look bigger. And I'd be his cowboy boyfriend, and there'd be everyone off to the side and Mark and me. And we would just sort of pose under the, to these lights because no one wanted to go near him. He was so angry and so mean to everyone else, but never to me. He never, ever, ever was mean to me. And that was part of his projection. He was so competitive, so competitive.
And once he did have HIV, I mean, I just think about somebody like David Wojnarowicz, whose work is also marked by a very, very intense anger, but a very different kind of anger. And it was an anger that was directed much more at social injustice than it was at any sort of just vague sense of being the product of bad fortune. And in Mark's case, I feel like the anger was more atomized and random in a way, and maybe more intense. But I think the anger that marked that generation, which had everything to do with the AIDS crisis, of course, has somewhat disappeared. I don't find that degree of anger anywhere in the culture at the moment, not to that extremely acidic degree.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it was the time. David had a community similar to Mark's, but I mean, his death was really examined as it was happening.
Yeah.
Totally. The catalogs, the shows, the wakes. Mark died with me, no one would go near him because he was just ostracized, and it was so sad and so alone. So there was a difference back then of the anger, and that's why Mark made art at the end. Mark wasn't writing seminal, angry catalog excerpts with Nan. He was making art in the bathtub until the very end with his blood. Whatever he could reach and get, he was making stuff. It was amazing. Do you have any questions?
All right, I think that's probably enough. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.